Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Pepe Jijon TyOxidator wash processed Ecuador from September Coffee Company. There's the bag right there. And September, based out of Ottawa, Ontario. And this makes back-to-back Pepe Jijon reviews, having previously reviewed this same coffee from Thankfully Coffee in our last video. And just like with that video, Kyle Russell reached out to us and asked if we were interested in reviewing this coffee, knowing how much we've enjoyed it from other coffee roasters in the past. So just like from that video, I told Kyle to let us know when they were releasing this coffee so we could purchase it. So I'm looking forward to discussing September's take on it, as this right here is day 42. And recipe we went with for this coffee was the exact same as our previous review, which was a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 94 degrees Celsius, about 201 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. So this one was a little bit more reminiscent of Manhattan's version of it that I remembered from over a year ago now, which is to say that it was also a very light coffee by most standards and metrics, which also goes to say that it is a notable bit lighter than some of the other versions that we have reviewed of this coffee in the past. But for the most part, it's still just a pretty light coffee in general, as September is one of the lightest roasting Canadian coffee roasters out there. With all of that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 15, first impression, and we opted for the V60 with our standard recipe, and this one was much more in line with the expectations, as it wasn't particularly flavorful, but rather quite light, tame, moderate, and mostly an abundance of potential lingering underneath the cup in general. In line with the first impressions of so many other versions of this coffee, leaving a lingering, savory, and herbal floral sense to the cup, with a lot of the sweetness potential being there. We continue on to day 18, ran into the Chemex and a lot of the same issues, as for the most part, it just felt overly light. The cup is very delicate and subtle, to a point where the sweetness is even relatively muted relative to other versions of this coffee, and I knew some adjustments were required. Day 21 through the April brewer, and there was a notable bit of improvement, as it felt like just a little bit of rest has helped this coffee a fair bit. Still very light, but it continues to offer a fair bit of the lingering sweetness to the cup, much more of the notable brown candied aspects in abundance, as well as a general sugary aspect to the cup, a slight candied orange, and more of the herbality. For the most part, this was a little bit more in line with a lot of the previous experiences I'd had with Pepe. But let me stop right there and say these first couple of experiences are extremely in line with so many experiences with this coffee, as once again I will say that usually the first couple of cups of this coffee are a little bit of a throwaway, as rarely do I enjoy this coffee with my standard recipe. It's interesting that the lowering of temperatures, just kind of the lower extraction of this coffee, seems to help for whatever reason. That's been consistent throughout, and that was present yet again, as here on day 25 we opted for that adjustment, lowered the temperatures. Notable improvement once again, as the cup continues to skyrocket on the cool down, with much more an emphasis on the sugary sweetness. A little bit more of the classic Mejorado brown candied sweetness, followed by a classic herbal floral cup with a very slight savory aspect to it. Candied citrus also present, very much in line with so many of the other previous experiences with Pepe's coffees. So that's what I'm picking up here, is once again, these coffees, they seem to offer a lot of similarities in form of the template that it has. And that's of course going to be most specifically that Mejorado brown candied sweetness, a slight bit of citrus, a lot of sugar in general, and then in addition to that, that herbal, floral, and sometimes savory sense to it. Experiencing it a fair bit in this one right here, all of those profiles, all of those expectations. We continue on to day 28, opted for the Chemex with the same adjustments, and this struggled ever so slightly with these same adjustments, as the majority of the flavor profile is present on the finish, as it offers this fizzy citric component to it in a long-lasting sense before transitioning into the sugary aspects to it. Even then, not necessarily quite as well defined or pronounced. So that was the first big takeaway, that for whatever reason, this one also didn't really seem to have a lot of success with the Chemex. So we continue on to day 31, same recipe as day 25. And this Pepe is slightly different in the sense that it is super sweet right at the start, before it transitions a little bit more into the overall complexity of it. And it's usually the other way around, as the cup usually finishes into that very long-lasting brown candied aspect to it. initially a lot of those classic components to it right at the forefront before it settles into an almost delicate lemon candy-like component and does cool off even further into an explosion of those sugary sweet aspects and plenty of the listed floral herbality to it. Hibiscus, once again, mentioned that in our previous video and mentioned that in so many of our previous Pepe reviews in general. Day 34, a slight bit of inconsistency as we opted for the same recipe. This one was a little bit more savory today as there was the slightly grainy quality, which is another thing we've mentioned in a lot of the previous Pepe reviews. Still plenty of sweetness in the finish, not quite as good as some of the earlier days, but on day 38, it was fixed as it went back to being its best as we continued to remain consistent with our recipe, and it rewarded us by offering many of the high level of sugary aspects in the cup as it skewed in multiple directions. At this time, I would say there was a slight maple syrup-like component to it, as it offered a sugary white peach and plenty of that mejorado-like brown candied aspect as well. So getting an abundance of super sweet characteristics to it definitely did seem to offer this one some really nice aspects. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have one level 5, and that one won't come as a surprise to anybody. It is the sweetness at a level 5, as these Pepe Jijon coffees continue to offer just ridiculously sweet coffees, as this one right here continues to remain ridiculously sweet. The most notable and consistent theme throughout these coffees, in addition to the brown candy characteristic of them, although the other things also seem to be notable in terms of just the experience that you're experiencing from this coffee. But yes, level 5 sweetness definitely on this one. Then we have a bunch of level 4s. We'll start with the cleanliness level 4. I mentioned in our previous video, I think it's almost always going to score that level 4 unless something went horribly wrong with this coffee. I think that's kind of the cap for this one, as it's never going to necessarily be the most overly clean coffee to begin with, mostly because it does offer some complexity in other directions, as I've kind of mentioned. There are a handful of characteristics that seem to be consistent with these coffees overall. Finish, level 4. Once again, it is on the higher side of the level 4, as it does offer a very long-lasting finish, but not to the extent where it's overbearing, and I keep going back to that every time I discuss this coffee, but level 4 is the perfect spot for it. Florality, level 4. Once again, the hibiscus-like components within this one present right from the start. That's something that I think is going to be consistent with all of these coffees from Pepe Jijon. These TyOxidator wash-processed Típica Mejorado coffees has been present right from the first time we tried it a year ago plus, and continues to be present with the coffees we have from them today. Citrus fruit, level 4. So once again, the citrus fruit is one of the more notable characteristics of it. At one point, I described it as being a little bit more of a fizzy citrus, but that's also been something that's been consistent in these Mejorado coffees. But what's catching my eye a little bit more about this tasting wheel is the stone fruit being at that level 4. I think we experienced a fair bit of the white peach characteristics in the Leuchtfeuer version of this coffee, and I could say that since there was a sugary stone fruit-like aspect in this one quite often, it's interesting that that scored that level 4, but once again, you're noticing very subtle differences between all of these coffees, as they all follow that same template. I've already said that, but some of them skew ever so slightly in specific directions, and that's what makes comparing these coffees alongside of each other as fun as they are. Caramel level 4, and that's been a pretty consistent theme. I'm not sure that many of them scored any lower than that. I don't think any of them scored a level 5, but level 4, I continue to chart it there because it is just so strong and pronounced, well-defined within this coffee. And then we have a couple of level 3s. We'll start with the acidity level 3, and I think it's because I really wanted to note that relative to our previous review. It's not necessarily the brightest coffee. The previous one was notably brighter than it, and given that I was drinking these two coffees side by side, and I was like, man, you really have to kind of nitpick and spot some differences between these coffees, though that one skewed a lot more in the citric direction. It also offered a little bit more brightness. That was one of the takeaways I had, was that this one did not offer quite as much brightness to it, which is fine. Not necessarily a huge priority for me. Berry fruit, level 3. Once again, that has also been a consistent theme with so many of these Mejorado coffees, is that they seem to score around that mark. I can't remember. I think that most recently Manhattan's version of this coffee has switched. They had a citric note to it from it to something along the berry lines. Even then, the berry continues to remain around that level 3 mark for these coffees, nowhere near as pronounced as some of the other fruit characteristics to it. And then the other thing really worth discussing in this tasting wheel is the body at a level 3, because I mentioned in the previous review that the Thankfully, coffee version of this didn't have quite as much body, which is a theme for these coffees. This one right here, once again, drinking it side by side really seemed to help because I could kind of nitpick which one had maybe a little bit more body, maybe a little bit more brightness. So this one offered a slight bit more body than that version of this coffee. But as I'm just kind of looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I'm getting from this coffee. But as you kind of look at the two tasting wheels side by side from the last two reviews, I think you can see that the coffee in general is very similar. A lot of these numbers are scoring around the same mark in this tasting wheel. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. This one seemed to mirror the Manhattan version as well as the Apollon's Gold version a little bit more closely than it did any of the other versions of this coffee that we had reviewed, which is a really good thing because those have been my two favorite versions of this coffee. So when I was able to get this one right, it offered exactly what I wanted for it, and it was sacrificing some of the things that weren't necessarily my biggest priority, most specifically the overall brightness to the cup and a lot of those citric components. I could give or take those. What I'm looking for most specifically is the sweetness and that brown candied aspect, which continue to remain in very notable and significant abundance within this coffee. Though I do have to say, I think I found the Thankfully coffee to be ever so slightly sweeter than this one, which I think it's one of those things where I would have to try all these coffees side by side to really nitpick exactly which one was the sweetest, as it's basically comparing a bunch of level 6 sweet coffees side by side and being like, this one is ever so slightly sweeter without necessarily knowing for sure. Though drinking them side by side, once again, I feel like the Thankfully coffee was just slightly sweeter. And if you ask me which one I preferred, it just kind of depended on the day, if I'm being completely honest. They were both great. This Pepe Jijon coffee is just incredible, and I think that's just my overall thoughts. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if we're being very specific, first things first, if you've enjoyed these Pepe Jijon coffees in the past, you'll like this one. It offers exactly what you're looking for from these coffees. So what will set it apart specifically and different from a lot of the other ones? I'm not entirely sure, if I'm being completely honest. Again, I think it's a compliment that it seemed to bear two of my favorite versions of this coffee, which is, of course, that very high level of sweetness, great clarity as you would expect, and a lot of that brown candied aspect to it, just sugary aspects in general. Maybe the one thing that's slightly different is that it offered a very similar profile to those two, while offering a little bit more of the sugary stone fruit than the Manhattan or the Apollon's Gold version of it. It's kind of the best thing I can think of that sets this one apart from those, and I think kind of the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this version of this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Pepe Jijon TyOxidator wash processed Ecuador from September Coffee Company. Thank you for watching.